Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's and our very last webinar of the year, Shielding Your Network Devices, Proven Strategies to Defend Against Advanced Threats. My name is Melissa Russell, and I'll be the host for today's session. Before we get started, I just wanted to let everyone know that we are recording this session, and we will make a link to the recording as well as a link to the slides available in a follow-up email that you'll see from me. At this time, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker, Wes. Wes Dobry is our VP of Solution Engineering here. And if you do have any questions, by the way, just throw them in the Q&A and we'll hopefully have a few minutes at the end of the session to take some questions. But at this time, I'd like to go ahead and hand it over.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Melissa. And so again, my name's Wes Dobry. I'll get in a little bit more about me in a moment, but today I wanted to give a quick talk about shielding your network devices and kind of talking through a little bit about some of the techniques that APT groups are using, some of the known exploits and things like that out there. And ultimately, when we start to dig through this, I want to go through ultimately how we got here, some analysis of some of the high profile exploits that are out there. Talk about some of the ways these APTs are implanting into devices, go through a little bit of lull bins and how they're living off the land on these pieces of equipment, detection techniques, and of course, hopefully some takeaway items as well. So a bit about who I am is I've been doing cybersecurity now for over 25 years with a focus on architecture and strategy. So I've always had multiple different groups that I've focused with around network, as well as servers, virtualization, endpoints, all the above. But my area of expertise really focuses in modern threat vectors. So that's things like hardware, firmware attacks, identity deception, social engineering, and then now, of course, with the pervasiveness of AI, obviously, I've taken an interest in that around how to do things like attack, defend, and poisoning of AI models. Of course, here at Eclypsium, I run our solutions engineering team, which is a global team where we help organizations around the world to understand these threat vectors and how we can help. So it's 2024. Is this actually something new? And the long and short of it is that when we look at what's happening from a network device perspective, this is not just something new. It's actually rapidly accelerating. It's been around for a long time, and it's getting more and more of a greater threat to every organization on the planet. It's when we look at things like your typical endpoints and servers, those devices have so much purview on them and people are watching them so closely, it's became much harder to get into those environments. 0 days are very expensive. The attack chains that they have to build are super complex. You have a multi-$100 billion EDR industry out there. So the attackers have started to do things like move lower in systems, into firmware, and start to target areas where they're not being monitored as much. We're also seeing that initial vectors of attack aren't as successful against enterprises. This is things like phishing and you still have your credential attacks, which are still pretty successful. But ultimately, when we start to look at the targeted attack vectors, we're seeing things that now even nation-stated techniques are available for typical cyber criminals. This ultimately has led to things like dwell times being measured in months versus days, because not only are they getting into a different area, they're also moving in there in a way where they can get access to other things and hide and evade other detection techniques for much longer periods of time. So why is this, and really why have we seen this major shift, is that when we look at things like endpoints and servers, we have tools and technologies like patching and drive encryption and system hardening and vulnerability and risk management agents and EDRs that are all monitoring and working in environments like Windows and Mac and Linux, and ultimately it's done to build a comprehensive architecture to protect those typical initial vectors of attack. But when we look at something like a switch router, firewall, load balancer, all of those other appliance-based solutions, we end up in a scenario where we only have one thing, and that's simply to trust the vendor. And this means that since they're treated differently, we have much different initial vectors of attack on them, and ultimately a lot different perspective to how they're patched and maintained. So when we look even in history from 2005, and this slide goes through 2018. Back in 2005, we saw really the first Cisco rootkit. But over time, we saw other attacks that came into this where we started seeing more attacker groups start to focus on it. We started seeing larger attack vectors, like things like SolarWinds, as we all well know, and Fortinet vulnerabilities. But then when we get into 2021 through current, you see a massive increase in the number of vulnerabilities exposed as well as the number of attack vectors, all the way up to, nowadays in 2024, where we have, the SaltVault and Flax Typhoon campaigns. And we saw things like the Ultimate Supply Chain attack with XZ recently. And then, of course, all the Avanti 0 days earlier this year as well. Now, this is largely due to these attacker groups or these APTs having some change motivations. What we're seeing is nation states are adjusting to using it as part of their warfare campaigns or psyops campaigns to, have ways to perform espionage or steal IP, or even as part of geopolitical tensions or from the AI threat side of things. And this largely is driven by revenue generation or espionage campaigns that are largely targeted to the organizations that they're going after. Whereas on the ransomware side of things, we see that they still continue to focus on money, fame, and power. Now, when we take a perspective of looking at these motivations, they're all driven and provided and supported by still networking infrastructure. So as these attackers start to shift their focus, we also find that they're starting to go and change their targets to finding easier vectors into the environments. So when we look at now, why is it actually worse? And traditionally, network device, network appliance firmware has always been very proprietary. It's been hard to exploit, mostly undocumented, and it's been very hard to remain persistent within those devices themselves or in those appliances. When we think of something like Cisco IOS, it's been delivered as a single image that's unpacked on boot. It has low persistent storage. Now, when we take a look at a lot of the current and modern device appliance firmware, we see that it's actually full operating systems. We see they're based on things like Linux or FreeBSD. Some of them are running hypervisors and or even Kubernetes in things like some of our core routers nowadays. And this means that we're seeing a big shift to leveraging third-party dependencies in these environments, which of course incurs a larger amount of supply chain risk. Again, supported by things like the recent XC library vulnerabilities or supply chain attack. Now, this also means that even though these devices are Linux or FreeBSD, they're largely unsupported by EDR. So they're not actively being monitored from the EDR vendors or the solutions like that. They still have other methods that we need to use to detect compromise. So, one of my call to actions that I always say when I have conversations with other vendors is that vendors should have a little bit of ownership in this. We have seen the industry build black box architectures that really prohibit not only security research, but also the ability to detect security incidents. We've seen that the code that they leverage is generally very old in a lot of ways because they function in largely off of things like security by obscurity. And so when they find that they don't need to patch something and patch vulnerabilities, largely the vendors say, hey, I don't really need to. They focus their time on things like features, and security isn't the top priority. So, when we look at how these devices are built, we've found that a lot of their architectures are still built off of when these devices were first released. So their architecture inside the devices are 10 to 20 years old. So they've built and just band-aided solutions on top of that, continuing to update these devices. Now, we've all dealt with this where these manufacturers give us things like reduced shells on them. Even though they're built off of Linux, they restrict the shell to only their utilities and their tools, which makes our forensics incident response processes incredibly difficult, or even in some cases impossible, because we don't even get access to the same tools that the attackers had as part of this. It also means that when we look at things like patch management on these devices, that we can't incorporate it in the same patch management that we're doing for things like our endpoints and servers and things like that. So this is all really driven simply because there's no financial motivation for vendors to improve this. So they have no reason to shift and adjust because there's nothing actually punishing them in these situations. So this ultimately exists to say that there's no real award for the most secure vendor out there. And so these vendors are largely going to focus on the things that they can use to drive their revenues. So I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about an emerging threat that's occurring. Well, I shouldn't say emerging because they're actively out there and actively exploiting things, but largely focused on things like telcos. And so we have the Salt Typhoon APT, which has been focusing heavily on US and international telco companies. And these attacker groups, or Salt Typhoon, is suspected to be a Chinese-based APT. We've seen them in Singtel, AT&T. You heard about them in Verizon. We also saw a couple other telcos, like one in the Ukraine, one in France, and then we also just recently had an announcement from Australia saying that they will refuse to use any Huawei equipment because they believe that it's likely already been compromised by the time that they receive the equipment. So, I mean, even as December 8th, we've heard about 8 or more additional telcos that are facing these same cyber attacks that are largely from these nation state actors. In December, after these 8 telcos were revealed as compromised, we actually saw some internal reporting from FCC and CISA around the issue. CISA relating to guidance on how telcos can secure their systems, specifically for the threat vectors that Salt Typhoon is using. And then for FCC around needing to increase visibility and hardening for communications infrastructure. Now, when we look at these, they really highlighted on things like being able to actually monitor what's going on with these devices, of inspection of modifications and alterations to the equipment. So monitoring for config change, as well as integrity changes on the device. So meaning that the firmware, monitoring it for any sort of changes. Inventorying both the devices and the firmware that are on them and ensuring that they're up to date, patching it to make sure that there's minimal vulnerabilities, risks, and of course, maintaining OS updates on those things. And then also some specific Cisco related guidance around identification of specific CVEs related to them, configuration options which can reduce the risk, and what features to disable to, again, reduce the attack profile of these devices. Now, when we look at this, there was a large number of CVEs used by Salt Typhoon, Volt Typhoon, Pacific Rim, Flax Typhoon, Velvet Ant. There's a lot of different APTs going on right now, which are targeting these kinds of devices. You see that these CVEs exist from everything from Pulse Secure, Cisco, F5, Sophos, Avanti. Largely, it's a big number of CVEs that we need to be monitoring for if our devices have it. And then on top of that, inspection of IOCs, or indicators of compromise, on these specific attack vectors. Just as a quick little plug of the company I work for, Eclipsium, we do help to detect both these CVEs as well as the IOCs related to them. Now, shifting gears, I want to talk a little bit about the exploits related to some of these known types of an attack. A good example of this is back in 2022. We had the F5 CVE related to header tampering, where you could just literally replace a header on communications to the device. And instead of using real authentication, you could use a host header to bypass the authentication. This ultimately gave remote command execution on F5 devices and gave the ability for attacker groups wide exploitation of this device. This ultimately led to not only APTs exploiting it, but simply once it got into the script kiddie's hands, PHP shells being accessible out there on all of these F5 devices that were available. And there were a substantial number of them that were available with their management interfaces exposed to the internet, which allowed this simple bypass to get root access to these devices. In 2023, we had Barracuda that was their email security gateway that actually allowed code execution if you sent in a malicious Office attachment. And this is always one of those fun ones where you think about this entire device's purpose is to effectively monitor for threats coming in via email, and it can get a threat on it through code execution when you send an Office attachment across it. This was actually really interesting because it let the device get completely taken over by simply sending in a malicious Office document. This was exploited by Chinese APTs as a 0-day, and it actually ended up where they could exploit the device and get into the local configuration and add persistence through local configuration options. This was actually so bad that customers had to physically replace these appliances or completely rebuild these appliances because they were so ingrained in the appliance after they were exploited that you really couldn't assure you were ever secure on the integrity in that device. Now, in 2023, we also saw Cisco's iOS XE scenario where they had a vulnerability around unauthenticated admin access. And what this allowed the threat actors to do was create new admin users. Now, there were a number of groups exploiting this as a 0-day, but it was never found where these groups were coming from, what their motivations were. But when this 0-day became available, there were tens of thousands of these devices that were immediately breached related to this. And again, it's still unknown as of right now that who this bad actor group was and what their motivations were, whether they were just someone building a large botnet or whether they were someone doing espionage and needing additional capabilities of having another shadow network that they managed. In 2023, we also saw Citrix Bleed, which was a simple buffer overflow. It actually allowed the threat actors to leak VPN session tokens, and this was also exploited as a 0-day. What was interesting about this one to me was that when Citrix released a patch for it, the patch that they released didn't actually reset any of the existing VPN sessions. So if a threat actor had already dumped those session tokens, they could reuse them even after the device was patched. So that actually meant that now, even though people thought that these devices were patched, threat actors were still using the existing session tokens and still getting into environments, even though the vulnerability had been supposedly closed. And this resulted in organizations like Boeing, mortgage companies, and of course, some internet service providers to be breached by using this simple buffer overflow. Now in 2024, we've seen some real fun ones. First, of course, is Avanti Pulse Secure for this SSL VPN appliance. And this was just a simple path traversal. Imagine going out to a single web link that immediately dumps to giving access to a root shell on the device. This was incredible, and it was crazy that it was available. Obviously, it was also exploited as a 0-day. And this one was curious because when Avanti did attempt to patch this, the mitigations that they provided, as well as the patches that took them forever to release, were easily bypassed. So this actually was so significant that CISA told the U.S. government where they had these to immediately disconnect the devices and stop using them. This also meant that as soon as they did disconnect these devices, the U.S. government had to go find alternative solutions for what they could do relating to SSL VPNs. Now, one of the other things that was interesting in the research of this vulnerability was that Avanti's supplied integrity checking tool was bypassable. So you could easily create a different way of doing integrity or modifying their integrity tool, and it allowed the device to be compromised, persistence to be built into it, and then when that device ran its integrity check, would still say everything was good on it. So it was one of those scenarios where really easy to exploit vulnerability that was exploited for a long time because of a delayed patch release, had major implications, and the tool that was provided to validate the integrity of it was also easily bypassed. Now, when we take a look at these types of vulnerabilities and compare them to simple MITRE framework type of vulnerability scenarios, we end up where these are simple things that should not be occurring in devices. First off, when we look at Citrix Bleed, a simple buffer overflow is not anything that should ever make it out with the tools and the technologies that we have for code inspection. When we look at things like number 3 here around the vulnerabilities under CVD, we have scenarios where common vulnerabilities should, again, never be detected. Things like SQL injections or, host header bypasses, those types of things. Again, not things that should ever make it out into the public. Same thing for when we look at path traversal with Pulse Secure, or when we look at other scenarios like the Megarack type of things where we have hard-coded passwords. Nowadays, we should be holding our vendors accountable where these simple types of vulnerabilities are not things that should be embedded in devices that we consider such as critical infrastructure. So switching gears, want to talk a little bit about the implants that some of these threat actors are using. So we talked a little bit about the exploits they're using to get in. Now, if we talk about the implants, first that we see is that, again, since a lot of network devices take a methodology where they generally will go and boot into something like a Squash FS image where their only persistent information is in a configuration partition, you end up seeing a lot of non-persistent implants. And this means implants that don't survive an appliance reboot. This is things like reverse shells via Netcat, and I have a typo there, sorry about that, or where we see basic payloads through, can't pronounce that today, sorry. Or we see things like basic sliver payloads, or we see a lot of things like web shells that exist on these non-persistent storage. So again, if they get the capacity to write something out, they write something out into a non-persistent location to give them something like a PHP shell or a web shell, or some kind of a simple payload framework like Sliver. Now, PHP web shells, of course, this is very, very common as a first payload. Many of these network appliances use PHP under the covers to drive their web interfaces. Also see this commonly as a secondary or backup payload on devices. We do also see these in scenarios like APT29 using them to restart other implants that they have in the devices. So they go and exploit, get a PHP web shell, use that to go and start up their more advanced command or C2 frameworks that they have, and ultimately get even deeper access in the device. We do often see these dropped into simple web GUI paths. So if they get the right ability into the device, drop it into a different path in the web GUI, and then they can always use that path to get into it. You'll also see these advanced actors changing PHP configs if they have the ability to change them in a device, which leads to you want to monitor these PHP configs for change. And these are generally highly and easily detectable, like you can see in the screenshot here, around understanding exactly what it should look like from an integrity perspective on the device, and look for anything that has been added to it on a regular basis. Now, credential sniffers are another common vector that we see. This is things like JavaScript being added to login pages so that even though it doesn't look like there's anything changed, collecting those credentials so that they can be retrieved from at a later date or being automatically sent to the threat actors. This was actually actively used in the Citrix Bleed campaign, where they modified the pages to collect the credentials and then exfilled the credentials directly from the organization. And we also have seen these both in a persistent and non-persistent fashion. So non-persistent, you reboot to the appliance, it goes away. Persistent, it's there even through things like updates, upgrades, reloads, restarts, everything. And this is really largely dependent on whether it actually updates the GUI components within the UI itself. Now, this is generally protected against from MFA. So again, if you're still not doing things with MFA on critical systems, this is an easy thing that an attacker can go and gain those credentials and then use them in other areas where those credentials may be reshared or reused. Now, Sliver is an interesting open source C2 framework I actually use it in a lot of my own research because it allows easy pivoting from one device into another in backend networks. So again, when you compromise an internet-facing device, you could then go and use its internal interfaces to cross the beachhead and get into an environment and move between or move laterally within environments. It's actually written in Go, so it's portable across pretty much all the OSs out there. It runs on virtually every single network appliance I've ever tested it on, and you actually saw it recently used in the Avanti campaign. It is easily detectable. It has large files, and this is something where while it is easily found, again, a lot of folks are not actually using it from an investigation standpoint or understanding how to detect it on their own appliances. Now, Pacific Rim, another APT, they've actually started to move to persist in firmware within environments. So they've been able to go and backdoor firmware to persist through upgrades. And we've actually been able to go and see them use very advanced techniques to modify existing firmware on devices to start to move lower in the stack. One of the things that we've seen them use is actually a UEFI implant that's where they either verify that Intel boot guard's not enabled, or go ahead and bypass it on the appliances that they're attacking. So when we look at scenarios like this, even if an appliance is leveraging secure boot, if the attackers control the earlier stages of UEFI, like in this case, they can either disable it or bypass it themselves. So in this case, they actually targeted firewall appliances, which after you actually looked at them, they were just simply Intel-based PCs. So in this case, the attackers were observed in the wild attacking things which were virtually PCs, servers, and laptops. Now, if we actually look at that implant and the technique that they used to do that on a device, it was actually relatively simple. As soon as they managed to get shell on the device, they downloaded their modified version of a firmware binary, simply extracted the existing firmware, and then wrote their own and appended it with the backed up version of it. So in this case, it was a very simple, as this shows here, 6-command attack to turn off a fundamental security feature in that specific device that they were attacking. Now, we also see custom appliance malware being used out there as well. And this is, again, largely used by Chinese APTs, where they're generally using 0 days to get in. They're using custom implants, and they're very, very highly evolved and focused towards these specific devices that they're attacking. We saw this heavily utilized in 2023 campaigns against Fortinet, where they were using things like kernel modules and custom services. We also see these types of custom malware used in, again, other advanced threat actors like BlackTech, which targets Cisco devices and implants directly into the firmware or the iOS on those specific Cisco appliances. We're also saw them in Barracuda ESGs, or the email security gateways. So like before, they use the attack of running a malicious Outlook or Office attachment and then implant into the appliance itself. And then again, we also saw custom implants in Avanti too, in things like Pulse Secure recently. So a next kind of area where we see these attackers use is simply living off the LAN within the devices. And again, just to go back, we find most appliances are running Linux, FreeBSD, or some variant of those. And we also find that once you get out of their built-in shells, that they don't generally remove built-in utilities. They leave a lot of different tools and things that they used in their build components, or that are used by other things they're doing on the appliances. So this leads to things like FTP, curl, wget, and netcat to be existing in the device, which allows threat actors to download their payloads and get their stuff on the equipment itself. We also see a lot of tools like SSH, Telnet, and SMB to do things like be able to move laterally in an environment and attack other systems. And then also simple things if a device is using LDAP for authentication or has the capacity to, we often find that simple LDAP tools and packages are already installed, which allows the threat actor groups to do intelligence gathering and test their accounts, test credentials that they may have. And then we've even seen scenarios where development tools and components are existing on the device, things like Python, Perl, PHP, and Bash. I've seen some devices that have entire, build chains on them to build, C binaries and things like that on them, where you could literally go and compile your own executable and run it on that system itself. This also goes into including things like persistence. So your system control, your initd stuff, your all the different avenues, even things like cron to build in jobs and things to remain persistent and make sure that your stuff is always running on a system. So a great example of this is when we look at Velvet Ant, that targets and attacks Cisco Nexus equipment, and we say jailbreaking of it because they move from the limited NXOS layer to the underlying Linux on the system. This is kind of interesting because Cisco customers don't really have visibility into what actually happens on like the raw shell on this device. And this leads to making sure that when you're collecting information from these devices, that analyzing things like account logs, command histories, and other things on these devices is critically important to make sure that there's nothing nefarious occurring. In this example, you can actually see that they were able to go and use VI to create a file. They brought in their base 64 encoded binary into the environment. They did a checksum against it. They actually overwrote a built-in utility, realized, that's not what I really want to do. So they copied another existing utility that already existed on the device of curl and overwrote a library. And when they did this, they went through and double checked that, hey, they had everything that they needed. They added it into the library preload so that it always was existing on this device so that they could use it. Ultimately, this led to scenarios where these guys have keys to the kingdom. Once they've jailbroken these devices and gotten into the Linux kernel, you can do all the nefarious techniques that we see them do on other Linux systems. So, excuse me, we also see that when we look at large language models, that it's really beneficial to use them for both things like understanding what's on a system, how to write exploitations for you, how to even do things older. I use it all the time to go and throw a script in there like a Python 3 script and say, how would I rewrite this in Python 2? It's simple to go and say, oh, my server that I'm trying to do this on only supports Python 2. And it makes it easy to automate the easy stuff, focus on the more difficult things, and to even do things like bypassing known detections. For example, of scenarios of saying, I only have these specific utilities available to me. I would like to do this. How can I accommodate that? And it will generally find out ways to do it that are non-traditional. So it's an easy thing that the attacker groups are also using to adapt their attacks and use to get deeper into equipment. Now, we also find that these attacker groups rarely need to use any form of stealth. We find it extremely hard to detect them on appliances in operation. They are generally only detected because they break something. When your email security gateway goes down, you inspect it. If it doesn't, you are not generally looking at it. So if the attacker doesn't break things like traffic processing, nobody's really looking at that device and digging into it in most environments. So this has led to things like 18 to 24-month dwell times of these threat actor groups that are only discovered way after the fact when something else happens. And then suddenly it's like, oh, well, we found their initial vector. It was this appliance that was unpatched. And this has also led that we tend to not do active security monitoring on these appliances. We might be monitoring their logs and their application functionality, but we're not actively monitoring them in the same way that we would be looking at a Linux server, for example, or an endpoint, a Windows endpoint. And I've also found that network engineers, as great as they are in a lot of ways, they're not security folks. They're not needing to look at what happens if somebody exploits a shell on the device and gets into root. In those scenarios, they're only worried about do my VLANs still exist? Has my network configuration changed? And they're not looking at the other things because they're just expecting that appliance to continue to function. So, how do we actually detect these situations on these devices? And when we think of it being a Linux or FreeBSD device, you can use standard DFIR techniques on these Linux appliances. Anybody that's ever done Linux-based DFIR has a good idea of how these systems run and what they can do. So simply digging into them and using the same techniques that you would on a Linux system to look for strange logins, SSH brute forcing, unusual processes. Logs of process crashes are especially good, especially when we start to think of things like those PHP web shells and the like, where we can see them trying to implant or modify a configuration change, and they accomplish that by causing a process crash that gets their config loaded. Other scenarios like new user accounts is often an easy indicator of attack on these devices or indicator of compromise in some situations where, excuse me, where these new user accounts are easy to understand and easy to identify when we see a new local account. Same thing if we're not monitoring connections from this equipment to other systems. And again, that goes into the lateral movement approach, where if I see one of these devices attempting to connect to other devices that it shouldn't be, then that's an easy indicator that something nefarious is likely occurring on this device. Now, one of the things that everyone should be doing is configuration baselining on every piece of networking equipment. And that's establishing a base of a device configuration, regularly monitoring this off device and checking it regularly. Again, things like scripts via cron jobs works great because configurations shouldn't change very often. So looking at the configuration folder and backup sizes of it can be an indicator of if something's changed. This also goes into if you're baselining running processes and firewall rules and looking at things when there's adjustments to it. Understand what the normal network connections of a device are to identify if there's anything outstanding that should be investigated. My number one technique is also just simply blocking device initiated egress connections unless that device requires them. And in that case, I again shouldn't have a network switch sitting in my DMZ attempting to contact something internally on its management interface, for example. The other two big things is making sure that you have alerts set if a new user, a new local account is created on that device, and also alerts on process crashes. One, it'll help you know if something bad's happening. Two, it will also tell you if you have some kind of service availability issue on a device too. So another area to actively monitor is on-device startup scripts. Vendors will always have ways to execute commands, whether it be via cron or a initd or whatever those situations are. But monitoring these for things like new services, new init scripts, new entries in your cron tab. Of course, if you ever have an unexpected reboot, should always be investigated, and the startup log should be reviewed to see if there were ever any errors to start things. This is largely because attackers generally are not perfect. They do make mistakes, and something like a simple typo in a command can be the thing that easily is found in a startup script that says, oh, hey, this device has actually been taken over, and they goofed up in dropping their payload with a simple typo. Now, one of the coolest tricks that I use is actually simply directory checksumming. And I put the command in there, the ls command there at the top, where you can actually just simply do a SHA-256 of a folder. If it's the same, that hash shouldn't change. If it does change, so a config changes, a web GUI directory changes, something like that, that's something where you can actually be quickly alerted about it. This is something that can be automated on your own appliances via cron or even executed remotely on those devices if you have shell access to them. It will happen with false positives in configuration directories as config changes happen, but things like web GUI paths and the like should only ever change if the device gets an upgrade against it. So this is a scenario of if you're not doing this on things like persistent storage partitions, it's an area for attackers to build in persistency in their attacks. Same thing from user home directories. Again, on these devices, there shouldn't really have a lot of things being stored on them. And so if you're going and doing directory checksumming, it's a quick and easy way to see if there's any changes on these devices, which could be, again, indicators of something malicious. Also, you'll see oftentimes things like folders named with a space, 2 periods, or 3 periods, which can easily be missed as you look through directory structures. But be cognizant of that because they're easy for bad actors to use those to hide their toolkits in. I mentioned earlier around Avanti distributing an integrity tool. It was effectively a Python script with a huge list of hashes. It did go and use an encrypted tar.gz file, and there was a utility on the device that decrypted it. Largely, this tool it ignored most of the persistent storage on the device and even most of the non-persistent storage. It effectively didn't even notice when multiple different command and control frameworks were put on a device. And even in the scenario of using a command and control framework in conjunction with a startup script, their integrity tool didn't see it and it still allowed it to run unabided. So even if you are using tools like this to verify integrity, make sure that the tool is actually doing what it's supposed to and validating against that the true integrity of the device is not compromised. So shifting gears here a little bit, I've talked a lot about these threat actor groups and the attacks that they've used. I'll take a couple moments here and talk about where we focus at Eclipsium and how we can actually help with that. And what we do is we give organizations the capability to build trust in the equipment is the long and short of it. And that's it through assessment of current devices and new devices, as well as helping organizations with deploying patch management or device firmware on systems. The idea is assess new things before you put them in your network to make sure that they're not already compromised, and then regularly reassess them to continue to build trust on them. Way that looks is really a simple three-phase process: collecting the data from the equipment, so whether that's laptops, desktops, servers, or networking gear, extracting as much information from that device, so extraction of the firmware components, the configurations, all the details and things that I've been mentioning before around understanding what that device actually looks like. Then we run it through our assessment engine, or what we call Automata, which is where we're looking for things like threats, so indicators of compromise, testing for vulnerabilities, looking at configuration misconfigurations, or doing things like change monitoring, change tracking, and of course, known good verification. This device running Cisco iOS of a certain version should look a certain way. We know what that looks like. We helped organizations to understand what that is. Now, when we take a look at this compared to the common techniques and tactics that Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon are using, you'll see that there's actually overlap here in where we are doing firmware integrity monitoring against all the different types of devices on the left, where we can actually look at this iOS, ASA, and XOS devices that Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon are actively exploiting. And by doing so, we can actually tell organizations that we've found an IOC on them, for example. On the other side of the equation, around the vulnerability and threat detection side, same thing. We added a few more different devices in there, like Avanti and Fortinet devices, where we can still detect their vulnerabilities that they're using, as well as when they've actually added indicators of compromise on the device, we can understand and alert on those too. So, takeaway from today's session: it's going to get much worse before it gets better. These attackers will continue to have the upper hand for quite a long period of time. The groups of types of devices that they're using will largely not inherently add a lot of security in the near term. And as these attackers continue to go down this path, they're going to find more tools, techniques, and 0 days that are waiting to be found. And that these APTs are targeting the same exact devices as ransomware groups for initial vectors of attack. Now, largely, I see this as reasons that the vendors need to be held accountable. And this will likely only be forced when the government forces their hands. So nation state governments need to force the vendors to protect their environments, secure things in greater detail. It's also important to also remember that no vendor is really more secure than any others. Almost every one of these appliance vendors do the same exact thing. And one of the ways that we as organizations can help protect and make the world a better place is demanding software bill of materials from these vendors to provide transparency in what they're delivering. If we start getting SBOMs from vendors on these black box appliances that we get, that's where we'll start to identify more of the vulnerabilities, more of the legacy and ancient architecture that they're using, and ultimately get to a standpoint where building transparency into it will make everyone's jobs easier and more able to protect against these more advanced threats. And, if we wanted to try to raise the bar today, it's very simple. Understand that appliances are the number one target. These appliances generally have access to pretty much everything depending upon what they are. We should automatically assume breach of these and assume and isolate these devices heavily. So, microsegmentation and making sure that these devices have minimal access to as much as we can. It's also is smart to cross-train our networking and security teams so that when we have networking teams deploying these appliances, they're thinking of security best practices in mind too. Same thing from the tooling side of things. Building similar tools that both teams can leverage can make that identification of things quicker, reducing dwell time for attackers. The other thing that I always approach organizations with is don't be afraid of these appliances. They're just Linux. Dig into them, dissect them, understand how they work. Download free trials and familiarize yourself with the appliances before you purchase and deploy things. This gets you the capability to do better digital forensics on these devices as you need to. It's also great to have leadership support for as soon as possible patching on devices. Getting to a perspective of taking equipment down when you need to patch is critically important because in scenarios like Pulse Secure, where we had people afraid to patch them because they were their VPN appliances and couldn't take down VPNs, you need that ability to take systems down to patch them in major critical scenarios. The other thing here is that a multi-vendor strategy can also be effective because limiting your exposure on a single vendor allows your ability to shift workloads as necessary if one becomes suddenly targeted. So that's what I wanted to talk through today. I did see that there were a few questions that popped in as we were going through this. I'll spend a couple moments and go through those as we wrap up here. So Nicholas asked, how do they produce payloads that survive firmware reinstallation? And that's a good question. And part of that is actually that these these appliance firmwares sometimes don't override everything. They may do a reapplication of appliance files, but the configuration or the frameworks can actually still exist in config files. It can exist in persistent storage. They may not wipe and replace things like cron tabs. So you can actually end up in scenarios where these attackers can remain persistent on a device long after updates due to some other simple thing that the firmware update doesn't do. I see this in things like Citrix NetScalers, where the firmware update only updates the application files and doesn't actually overwrite the system firmware or the system initd scripts, for example. So implanting in a new system service allows you to add in that persistence capability. Mike L asked, do you have some version for home network? We do not today, but we may at some point in the future have the ability to scan home infrastructure and provide the ability for people to identify things like devices talking to China or things that we may be concerned with on that. But unfortunately today we are focused on the enterprise. Okay. And if anyone has any other questions, please throw them into Q&A. If not, I'll hand things back over to Melissa.
Thank you, Wes. And I did want to thank everybody again for taking time out of their day to join us. If you, oh, hang on, there might have been one more question that came in. Oh, thank you for whoever was the anonymous attendee that says happy holidays. We do want to wish everyone a really safe and wonderful holiday as well. If you did join a little bit late, I just wanted to remind everybody we did record the session and we will be making the link to the recording as well as the slides available. Thank you again, and we hope to see you on the next webinar in the new year.